meaning of development, worldviews, behavior, and ethics. And I will begin with the section segmentation and ethical standards. Segmentation implies a concentration on one of the constituent parts of a whole, as well as the separation or fragmentation of all parts. The part of reality on which the Western view concentrates is the material, that is, the appearance. Such a reality tends to be defined by what we see, touch, taste, smell, or hear, material existence, which by nature is temporal and lacking in inherent order. If we cannot experience life or have no way of acquiring knowledge except by counting and measuring through the five senses, then for us, the unifying principles of existence are fragmented and negated. This orientation leads to many things, but for the purpose of our discussion, most important are the ramifications for moral behavior and standards of ethics. When we rely on only what our five senses report as a part of our active consciousness, we mistakenly assume that our senses are apprehending a universal, objective reality that exists outside ourselves, and actually cut ourselves off from the infinite order of life. The material world, as we perceive, is not as it appears. It is, as we have learned, merely the slowest moving of an infinite energy whose boundaries are imposed by the limitations of our senses. In this way, we make ourselves the center of the universe, and what we perceive in nature, believed to exist outside of the self, we assume is ours to control and manipulate. As a result, survival, sustenance of physical self or material existence is contingent upon our ability to obtain and or control material objects. Competing for material goods and their control becomes an all-consuming endeavor. An egoistic orientation of this materialist competitive reality is extant. To the extent that self is defined in terms of individual form, and competition is the mechanism for attainment, attempts to gain increased wealth through shameless individualism will be an inherent consequence. An egoistic orientation grows out of this materialist competitive reality. Thus, we arrive at the primary values that pervade the segmented worldview: materialism, competition, individualism. This worldview regards human energy as needed to be expended for material gain. An optimal worldview regards human energy as an extension of the self and having access to all of the material world. In terms of behavior, another important area of examination is the manner in which people within the segmented culture are socialized to handle difference. The ability to perceive difference is basic to our functioning, but the ways in which we respond to the differences we perceive tend to be culturally specific. In Western culture, difference is treated with what I call a deficit orientation. When a difference is perceived, an evaluative judgment, usually hierarchical, is made. The less familiar typically receives the lower evaluation or status. This Western mode of difference handling is the natural consequence of the dichotomous two-valued logic that characterizes so much of Western thinking. Materialist existence is the primary basis for such reality definition. And the constant valuation of things creates an illusory sense of worth, meaning, and order. The new and unknown most often elicit fear or negative belief. This response is almost automatically and indiscriminately applied to all entities, from objects to people. In human interactions at the level of generalized culture, we see through such practices, such as slavery, colonization, genocide, etc., the most significant behavioral impact of the insecurity and fear and misappropriated sense of reality. When our belief structure is materialist, competitive foundation, we tend to base self-worth on external criteria. That is material wealth, prestige, and status concerns, looks, and so on. Such a system de-emphasizes the morality and righteousness of behavior because of the absence of a universal standard of ethics as the basis for determination. For goodness of character does not lend itself to being counted and measured by appearance. Therefore, the infrastructure of the segmented system devalues qualities of good character to the point of becoming relative, arbitrary, and difficult, if not impossible, to discern. Examples of the long-term consequences are prevalent. The lack of criteria for health and healthy behavior, reliance on pathological models, and a method of determining sane behavior that has come to be known as democratic sanity. If most sanction it, it must be sane. Under such a system, an enslaved person could be diagnosed as insane for running away. Homosexual behavior could move from being regarded as abnormal to normal. In a society, that basis of reality on this worldview, human sexuality will itself be distorted and sexual conduct disorderly. Rape, incest, sexual dysfunction and perversion, pornography, and so on will not be uncommon. These difficulties are due to the fact that the segmented, physically focused mind fails to integrate natural human urges to higher levels of moral function and interpret them in a manner conducive to sacred reverence for self, the human body, and respect for the sexual encounter. The sex act becomes the focus, and any form of intimacy is likely geared in that direction, rather than the sensuousness of human warmth and caring being expressed holistically, and sexual intercourse being a special sacred expression that celebrates the continuity of life. The human as a sexual being is fragmented into parts and objects. The Descartesian notion, I exist, therefore I am, compounds the materialist values to make identity tantamount to what one does occupationally, how one appears physically, and or what social roles one plays. To feel good about self, one has to be better than others in ways that are apparent. This may be falsely accomplished by attempting to put others down. Any distinguishable differences among people can be used to claim superiority. For example, skin color, sexual characteristics, age, weight, education, grades in school, income, clothes, and so on. Particularly in contemporary times, virtually any institution and all institutions within the segmented societies reinforce appearance versus essence. The unsubstantiated hierarchies that are created serve only to build more superficial and artificial mechanisms of exclusion and ostentation. In such a system, it is likely that leaders would be selected based on image and the letter of the law rather than justice would be served. The letter of the law would be served, but not justice. The saddest, most negative aspect of this system is the fact that people suffer and literally kill themselves trying to compete and achieve a sense of worth, value, and meaning. A truly positive sense of worth and psychological security can never be attained through external criteria. If all material trappings were attained, the space within us that is filled only when we achieve psychological security and peace of mind, those spaces would remain empty. The search for more would never end. For the less sophisticated, concern about what people think is often crucial because extended validation is needed for internal validation. Instead of becoming more conscious of themselves, they simply assume that others see them as they see themselves. The need for ego boost, false though they may be, become greater. A culture of psychologically oppressed, racist, sexist, workaholics, substance abusers, megalomaniacs, and other pathological or pathogenic persons is created. Stress, anxiety, depression, fear, and alienation are common. Mental and physical illness pervade. People become victims of a faulty conceptual system that resides in the individual and collective consciousness. Specific objects that are the focus of the Western segmented worldview may change over time. For example, from basic food and shelter to ephemeral luxuries. But the mentality and drive to attain them does not change. The values that guide and shape behavior, the way difference is handled, the manner in which identity and self-worth are achieved, these come together to reinforce a suboptimal mode of perceiving the world. Because of the finite and limited assumptions of this belief system, people become conceptually locked to the mode, believing that it's the best way, if not the only way, to perceive the world. Naturally, growth and development will be experienced as material, economic, and technological in terms of what's perceived of value, absent an overriding standard of ethics or guidance. So there will be no standard of ethics or guidance structuring how how material, economic, and technological growth will develop. Another outgrowth of the Western worldview is a skewed perception and changing of history. Because of the segmented nature and ethnocentric focus of the worldview, all events are planned, perceived, and purported to have taken place when and how they serve the interests of the West. They do not consider the rest of humankind and its reality. Those are discounted. For example, early man was a caveman, Columbus discovered America, and so on. According to the Western world, very few view the Native American genocide as negative, but rather describe it as the Great Western Expansion. And enslavement was a favor to the uncivilized African. More recently, Elvis Presley was designated as the king of rock and roll, and Benny Goodman, the king of swing. Yet the musical forms for which they have been honored were, in fact, created and performed by others first, African Americans specifically. They simply copied the patterns that would appeal to European descendants. Repeatedly written proclamations are misconstrued as historical fact. Repeatedly written proclamations are misconstrued as historical fact. Though particular ways of thinking result in negative consequences, people are not bad. And while we have identified nothing good resulting from the segmented worldview, an optimal perspective holds that everything has a value and a purpose. Let's look at the whole picture. Assume the divine order of the universe. Only then can we see the interrelationships of all things and find direction for unifying, containing, and transcending all opposites. The next section is holism and the natural order. Let me preface this description by reiterating that by traditional African culture, I mean African culture prior to the emergence of other cultural groups. Despite the fact that today Africa is an extremely large continent with much ethnic diversity, we find that in the past, certain philosophical and cultural ethos permeated the societies. From these themes, we characterize an optimal holistic worldview. African people develop physical and psychological characteristics consistent with their environments. If we follow the theory of racial differences discussed earlier, we find a congruence among the differentiating characteristics of the so-called Negroid and Caucasoid races. The identifying characteristics of these racial groups are not mutually exclusive, but exist as degrees along a continuum. At the same time, generalized differences can be anticipated. As African people lived in warmer, milder climates, where the materials necessary for survival were plentiful, they may have felt less threatened and less insecure. As their perception of the world changed in a manner consistent with their experience, aggression and the psychological correlates of insecurity no longer typified their behavior. Their behavior can best be understood in reference to today's concept of flowing with nature. Central to the traditional African worldview is the conception that everything is unified, interdependent, and an integrated whole. There is an order inherent in the unity of this holistic orientation that can be seen at all levels of nature and provide the impetus for an integrated reality and the basis on which the optimal is defined. The supreme reality that is the essence of humankind and nature binds and orders the universe. The essence of formlessness is the source of all form. The nature of being and existence is the expression of the limitless, the infinite. All existence forms a multidimensional channel through which one is consciously connected with the ancestors, the yet unborn, nature, and community. This orientation is the foundation of African science, whose achievements are evidenced by the pyramids, mathematics, astrology, and a unifying standard of ethics, to name just a few. The Western conception of knowledge suggests that external sources are the basis for knowledge. Such a foundation of objectivism and a positive empirical approach to science is problematic. The presumption of a spiritual essence taking on form or material appearance, however, encourages the restructuring of knowledge around that essence. Learning more about this is the purpose of life and leads to a mode of knowing the world that relies on multiple meanings of symbols and rhythm. One's essence or spirit and physical being are continually cycled, as is everything in nature. Levels of the natural order, thus discerned, and can be used as the framework for a standard of ethics, so that the levels of essence and the physical being continually cycled, as is everything in nature. Levels of the natural order are thus discerned and can be used as the framework for a standard of the natural order and ethics. Rather than control nature, the search to understand and function consistently with nature's laws is aided by the belief that each aspect of nature has a special and unique role to play in the larger scheme of things. each valued and studied with emphasis on integration and interdependence. In traditional African culture, to be out of harmony or rhythm with nature was regarded as harmful to the well-being and survival of the whole. Excuse me. In traditional African culture, to be out of harmony or rhythm with nature was regarded as harmful to the well-being and survival of the whole. Within the holistic worldview of optimal psychology, self-worth and identity are based upon being in tune with the whole or ultimate conception of one, such that self-worth is inherent in the realization of one's true essence. This awareness automatically makes us feel worthy, possessing a sense of well-being. We can sustain this positive identity by behaving in a manner consistent with this ultimate reality. Thus, behavior is shaped by an inherent ethical standard. External factors can neither add nor detract from the essence of our being. When existence is experienced beyond the five senses as a spiritual reality, apprehended in an extrasensory fashion, in order to be fully known, feelings become very important sensory mechanisms. Feelings also become a means of guidance on the pathway to higher consciousness, serving as an implicit, self-correcting monitor of ethics. Holistic development is evidenced by human and ethical concerns. This is consistent with the Afrocentric process of entomology. I'm going to end here for now, and we'll pick up next time with the next section, which will be the psychohistorical analyses of nations' behaviors. Thank you.
So good to meet with you again, Dr. Garvey. I'm so excited because this whole notion of the meaning of development is so central to what's going on with us even today. And as you've talked about, and we know, the Western invaders, colonizers, and enslavers actually built their wealth on the backs of African people and stealing other people's land or colonizing it, they would say. And as a consequence, they set themselves up as the first world and define development in material terms. And that definition of development around economic growth positioned them to have such power in so many ways, not the least of which is to ignore the importance of social change and justice. And as a consequence, the so-called developed nations kind of position themselves to behave very badly and totally exploit the so-called third world nations. Clearly, that couldn't have happened, excuse me, unless they had been able to convince African people to go along with it. And so what we're striving to do with our theory of optimal psychology is to help awaken us to not going along with it any longer and coming back to an understanding of the meanings of development that is more consistent with that of our ancestors. So I just wanted to ask your opinion relative to what has happened with the so-called first world and third world, how you see our transition, our transformation away from dependence and giving power to the so-called first world is going.
Well, that's very interesting. And, we adopt the language, we adopt the concepts, and we adopt the meanings of those who have captured us and oppressed us. just the use of your term first world. Well, who is the first world?
African people.
Yeah. So how can anybody else claim first world status and then demote us somehow to third world or whatever it is status? It's sort of turning everything upside down. But I think it goes back to socialization in terms of culture and understanding, and I think it's very important because certainly from the African perspective, which I would call the first world perspective. I hope our listeners or watchers don't get confused, because when I use first world, I'm going to be speaking of Africa as opposed to using first world for the Greeks, Romans, and whatever. But if we look at biological systems, I think there are three aspects of any biological system in terms of its development. One is that it has to have a safe space in which to develop. If the space is not safe, then it can't develop. So safety is important. The other thing that's important is the ability to control the environment so that you can move and do the things that you want to do. And then the third thing really is support and nurture. We're back to the old nature and nurture. So we need a certain amount of nurture so that we'll have self-esteem and confidence. So if we look at those things sort of individually, those 3 points. One, if you're in an environment and you're not safe, then you're going to be fearful for your own safety in terms of your life and your limb, so to speak. And survival is the number one priority in terms of a biological system. Again, if you're not safe, then you're going to try to compensate for the lack of safety. That's one way to deal with an unsafe system. Either you give in and you're fearful, and that's how you work with it, or you try to overcome the situation so that you create a safe situation around you. Now, two is similar in terms of control. If you have no control over the circumstances around you, then you're going to maybe seek somebody who has control and can help you. So you become dependent on that other person. Or you develop your own control and you really focus on controlling your environment, dominating your environment and controlling it. So these things that I'm talking about are compensatory measures. If you don't have the optimal circumstances for a biological system. I know we've been talking about optimal psychology, but there is optimal biology as well.
Absolutely.
I'm dealing right now with optimal biology. But you see, and then you look at the third thing, which we call nurture, if you will. If you're not loved, if you're not encouraged, if you're not supported in terms of what you're doing or what you're becoming, then you won't have confidence in yourself. You'll have low self-esteem, and either you'll be shy and introverted, or isolated, or definitely you won't have confidence in yourself and be able to do the things that you should be doing in the environment. So these are the three things that a biological system needs in terms of safety, in terms of control, and in terms of self-esteem. And the other things, if they're not obtained, are then going to be compensated for. And you develop these compensatory mechanisms. Now, I think if you look now at the socialization of the West, okay, the socialization of the West is relative to individualism, and it's relative to competition, and it's relative to materialism. So all of those things do not value or do not help the individual to gain support and safety within the environment, because the environment is a competitive environment where individuals are fighting against each other to gain the greatest materialistic accumulations, and that's what the society is based around, the accumulation of material goods. And of course, there's no end to that, because the more you have, the more you want. We've gone through that. And it's a gratification of your senses. And again, we can elaborate on all of that. And you know, and there's never enough for that in terms of what your eye can see, you know, what your mouth can taste, or what your nose can smell, or what you can feel, and on and on and on. And that's the whole, you might say, basis for the economic development in the West. It's manufacturing things for people to use and have, and it's also creating the stimulus for them to want these things. So we have this materialistic culture, and the way in which people are socialized into this culture is to be competitive, to be individualistic, and really to be fighting, you know, for survival, because it's as if to say that there is never enough out there, and you must always be competing for more. So this therefore develops within the culture all of these characteristics that are compensatory characteristics for a biological system who is trying to survive. So it's a suboptimal system for the flourishing of a biological system or a biological entity. It's a suboptimal system for the flourishing of a biological entity. And as you know, and when we contrast it, let's say, with the first world understanding of who we are, we're primarily spiritual entities. And then we express ourselves through our biology within a physical environment. But we knew and we understood that we were part of nature. So we were both nature and nurture, because we learned how to nurture each other from nature, because we never thought that we were separate and apart from nature. So we were one with nature, and it's the whole concept of oneness as the basis of who we are. And that is Ma'at, which we have gone through earlier on, in terms of Ma'at being the basis of our original civilizations, Nile Valley civilizations, that order, that interconnectivity and intercommunication, and that oneness, because you can't have order without oneness. So that has been the basis of our societies, and it's come forward into, you know, the concept of Ubuntu and communalism, which you find in all of our African societies. So if you have an improper